Good afternoon, everyone. It's time for our devotional. I hope that you're having a wonderful day and that you have plenty of opportunities to be able to enjoy your sunny day outside as it is. And if you want to take some time, I appreciate you taking some time with me to study. We're going to continue our series on the one word series that we've been doing, and today's word is judgment. And we're not going to talk about it in the way that a lot of people talk about judgment. When we think about judgment, often I think that we think about, people judging people, and, Christians, as the scriptures say, have no necessarily room judging outsiders, but we do need to care about those who are inside. It's not to say that we can't make judgment on sin, whether it's right or wrong. Obviously, we can do that. But the type of judgment that we're going to talk about today is the type of judgment that God is going to bring at the end. These next few lessons are going to be dealing with kind of final things. And so when we think about the final judgment, the end of it all, what comes to mind? The Bible has talked about God's judgment for quite some time. From the very beginning, we see judgment occurring. Though the word might not be used, judgment does happen. Adam and Eve, when it comes to their sin against God, breaking the rules, God judged. He cast punishment upon them and kicked them out of the garden. Cain, judgment. Noah, he brought judgment upon the entire world right after that. And several other times we see throughout the scriptures, God judges the Egyptian people and redeems his people out of bondage. And their punishment was great through the entire time of Egypt, that is. And when we think about judgment, even in the New Testament, Christ talked about judgment quite a bit, warned about it. But the Old Testament did as well. The Old Testament talked about a coming judgment for the entire world. Not in the same way, perhaps, that happened with Noah, because God promised that he would not destroy the world in that manner again. But he does talk about the judgment of people. In Psalm 96, if you look at verse 11, it says, "Let the heavens rejoice, and let the earth be glad. Let the sea roar, and all its fullness. Let the field be joyful, and all that is in it. Then all the trees of the woods will rejoice before the Lord, for he is coming to judge the earth. He shall judge the world with righteousness and the peoples with his truth." So when God comes to judge, he will judge with his righteousness, and according to his truth, he will judge the peoples. Now, the one thing that I think that most people would recognize today, especially if you're churched, right? If you go to church on the regular basis, you might be thinking of a verse that comes off into your head. And it comes from Romans chapter 3 and verse 23, in which Paul writes that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. It doesn't matter what side you're on. Paul was talking at that point to both Jews and Hebrews and Gentiles, the world, the rest of everybody. And he said there's no difference between the group. One claims righteousness this way, another can claim righteousness that way, but all sin and fall short of the glory of God. And when we hear that, we understand that we're in trouble. Why? Well, because we're being judged according to God's righteousness, judge the world with righteousness, Psalm 96 says, and also according to his truth. It becomes easy to see why we're guilty. The question then is, what is the punishment? If you were to have a bunch of parking tickets, for example, you've been driving around and maybe you just have made some boo-boos, didn't put your, tickets into your coins into the slots in the right times for your parking meters, and maybe you parked in some places you weren't supposed to park in downtown Nashville or whatever you're at, and you got some parking tickets to pay. Well, you go in and you make that payment. And usually that's probably not too bad. Even a speeding ticket, or two, hopefully not two, can set you back, but it's not that bad. But what if the payment for what you have done is astronomical? What if the payment was death? You see, when we're dealing with God and sin, that is what the payment is. When all fall short of the glory of God, we have to understand that we're all guilty of a death sentence. We have a death sentence upon us, and it is only going to be taken away by our Redeemer and our sacrifice, Jesus Christ. You see, Jesus Christ took death upon him for us so that we don't have to worry about it. So if we are baptized into Jesus, we have our sins washed away, we are redeemed, we become one with Christ in the likeness of his death, so that we can also, in resurrection, meaning our debt has been paid. That's, the redemption aspect of it. We were going to be brought into this death, but instead we are able to live because of Jesus Christ. So imagine for a second that a lot of people are in this death state because, well, really they are, right? But if that was the case, how are they going to get it right? Some people, they don't look to Jesus, or maybe they want to look to Jesus, but they want to wait. The problem is they don't know their court date. We look at this like a courtroom, right? God is the judge, Christ is there and he is judging as well. And you can either be on the side of the judge or the side of yourself and the world. We know what happens in that judgment. But so many people put off this idea of judgment because it seems so far off. I mean, it's not going to happen till it happens, number one. And if it hasn't happened yet, statistically speaking, it's probably not going to happen tomorrow. But that's the only way we can say it. It's probably, possibly not tomorrow, not later today, not in 5 minutes, that Jesus will return. And when we think about it that way, all of a sudden we realize we got to get ready. We have to be ready for this. Jesus talked about this, actually. A lot of his parables, talk about this, but Christ made very specific the idea that, as nobody knows the court date, we have to be ready. Starting in Matthew chapter 24, verse 36, Christ says this, "But of that day and hour no one knows, not even angels of heaven, but my Father only. Only God knows the day. And since only God knows the day, you can't know, nobody can know." I know how many people try to predict it out there, all these people who think they have the Bible code figured out. It's not true. Only God knows. Christ says he didn't even know. He says, "But all that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only." Only him. Okay, verse 37 says, "But as the days of Noah were, so also will be the coming of the Son of Man be." What does he mean? He's referring back to the days of Noah. And, Noah preached. We'll get to that in a little bit. But imagine Noah as an evangelist, and he's out there telling people, "Hey, the end of the world is coming. You need to get ready, and we're going to get into this ark." And people probably laugh, "Ha, ha, ha, crazy old Noah." And it says that that's pretty much what they did. Verse 38 says, "For as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took them all away. So also will be the coming of the Son of Man be." So in that verse, we see very clearly that, Jesus is saying people just lived their lives. They ignored it. They ignored the message. And that's just what people do. They ignore it, but then it's too late. So we don't want it to be too late. Jesus says, 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken, the other left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken, the other left. It's just going to happen, and people aren't going to know when it's going to happen. He says, "Watch therefore, for you do not know what hour your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known what hour the thief would come, he would have watched and not allowed his house to be broken into." It's kind of funny how it would work like that. And I think that's why Jesus really uses that illustration on a regular basis. It's coming like a thief in the night. It's coming like a thief in the night. No one knows what time the thief is coming. That's the whole point. If the thief wouldn't come if you knew he was coming, especially in Tennessee where there's a lot of people toting things, if you know what I mean. But verse 44 says, "Therefore you also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect." So I think he makes a valid point. Since you cannot know when Jesus is coming back, when the Lord is coming back, since you cannot know when judgment will be, then you have to always be ready. That's just the only option. Always be ready. You don't know the court date. Nobody knows. But you know the verdict. And if you want to change that verdict so that you know that the verdict is more positive in your favor, then wouldn't you do something about that before? If all sin means that we are violating God's law and falling short of everything he expects of us, and we understand that the punishment is death, if you could do something about that in real life, let's say you were going to court and you were going to be put to death, if you knew that if you just prepared beforehand and were ready when the judgment was going to be handed to you, that you would be acquitted and let go, would you do it? Of course you would. But the thing is we don't know when that judgment is going to take place. And so people do like in Noah's day. They just eat and drink and get married and all these other things. But Christians, since we've been acquitted, what should we do? We should preach this message. We may not know the court date. And aside from command of preaching this message, this is a wonderful reason to preach the message because we want to take as many people with us into the right side of judgment as possible. Noah tried. Speaking of Noah, since, they mentioned him here, we hear a lot about Noah in the New Testament. If you go back to Hebrews chapter 11, you're going to hear some interesting things about Noah. And Noah, he preached. I mentioned earlier, Noah was an evangelist in some ways, going out there trying to say, hey, look at this destruction coming, get ready, and if you want, you can hop on the ark with me, perhaps. Maybe that's what these texts means. I'm not exactly sure, but he did preach. And I'll tell you how we know. Because if you go back to Genesis, and you look at Genesis, you're not going to see anything about him preaching. But here, what we see kind of gives us a little insight into Noah. Hebrews chapter 11, starting in verse 7, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 7. By faith, Noah, being divinely warned of the things not yet seen, moved with godly fear, prepared an ark for saving of his household, by which he condemned the world and became heir of righteousness, which is according to faith. So the condemning of the world is an interesting point, but he did save his household. So I think what we can hear from this is that he preached, they didn't listen, they were condemned, and the ones who did listen, his household, they were saved. They got into the ark. A flood was coming. And if you want to hear him as a preacher even more, look at 2 Peter chapter 2. I think this is even more clear. Peter here talking about false teachers and the dangers of judgment that is coming forward for everybody, and the fact that God also can save, mentions this about Noah. Verse 4 of 2 Peter chapter 2, for if God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them down to hell, and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved for judgment, and did not spare the ancient world, but saved Noah, one of 8 people, a preacher of righteousness. He was a preacher of righteousness, bringing the flood on the world of the ungodly. You see, Noah did not bring the flood on. God did. Noah was a preacher of righteousness because God saw that he was righteous. And he saw that Noah perhaps maybe preached this, and he probably preached that people needed to get their life right because God was there. Either way, he preached. How many people did Noah save? 7 others. He was one of 8 people. One of 8. And so when we think about his success rate, it's not what matters. Peter calls him a preacher of righteousness because of what he preached, not how many notches he had on his belt. Christians today, there is a coming flood of judgment. There's going to come a time in which people are going to answer, and people are going to be drinking and eating and marrying and just living their lives. But we need to be sounding the alarm for people to be ready for the judgment, because they can be. It's not a message of pessimism. It's a message of hope and salvation for people who just don't know better. And we need to point them in the right direction of Jesus Christ, who can redeem them from this death sentence that so many people will not know that they even had. But they have sinned against God, and God will judge them according to his righteousness and his truth. So it's not that it's not fair. Everybody's given a life, and they have an opportunity to do right or wrong. The problem is so many people choose to do wrong. That's just the way it is. So we as Christians should preach this message, and we should be encouraged by the fact that we don't have to fear judgment because we have already been acquitted by Christ if we have been baptized into him. What a wonderful message of hope. What a wonderful message that we can share with others and, use it as an opportunity to speak to people. Especially now, I think there's a lot of time that people are out there and they're worried about what's going to happen. They're worried if they're going to die. They need to know that they need to be ready. Because whether a virus gets them or God comes back, whatever it may be, they need to be ready. I hope this lesson blesses you, and I hope that you will have a wonderful rest of your week. Thank you so much for listening today.